Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Now, since we've returned from the long weekend, I want to recap some of our previous reading and discussion of this book, The History of Romanism by John Dowling, a book that proves beyond any other book that the papacy is, was, and always will be the Antichrist of the Bible. The whole history of the papacy, the office of the papacy, is that man of sin, the son of perdition. He reigns over the kings of the earth, and this is how he does it. He makes sure that in every country, the Pope has the sole prerogative of appointing the hierarchs of the church, so that the hierarchs of the Roman Catholic Church in every country become the vassals of the Pope, and they do what the Pope insists upon occurring in every country. And this hierarchical structure of the Roman Catholic Church, as it exists in every nation, forms the shadow government of every nation. You hear all kinds of talk in the media and alternative media about the shadow government, the deep state, but no one ever tells you what it is. Well, history tells you unequivocally who it is. The shadow government of every country is the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy. So long as they are picked and invested in their positions by the Pope, they are the vassals of the Pope. And since the Pope claims to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords, it is their responsibility, the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy, to oversee and observe and control every visible government. The shadow government controls the visible government. And it's this quarrel over investiture. Who gets to pick the hierarchs of the church? Is it the king or the Pope? Is the very controversy that existed at this time that we're reading about in this book between Pope Innocent III and King John of England. King John thought it was his prerogative to pick the hierarchs of the church, to make the hierarchs of the church his vassals. But the Pope, as the popes always have and still do today, insist that they only have the power of investiture, and that the vassals, that the popes, or rather the priests, the monks, the bishops, the archbishops, all are vassals of the Pope. And this is the method by which the papacy oversees and maintains control over the visible government. Now, King John resisted this, so the Pope, in order to prove a point of how much power the Pope has, issued an interdict over the country and closed the churches, completely closed the churches. The people were denied the freedom to go to church. And so they couldn't be married, they couldn't be buried, they couldn't participate in the Mass, they couldn't, in other words, in a sense, to make this a short story, they couldn't participate in any of the sacraments of the church. And according to Roman Catholic canon law, the sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church are the means by which grace is earned. Okay? Salvation is earned in the Roman Catholic Church by participating in the sacraments of the church. There are 7 of them. I won't list them. We've done it so many times before, quite frankly. They mean so little to me that I can't remember from one instant to the next how exactly which ones they are. But when the Pope declares an interdict on a country, all the churches are closed. And since grace is no longer obtainable because the church is closed, this becomes of eternal consequence to everyone of the in the country who is a Roman Catholic. Okay? In an instant, the Pope can turn most of the nation, or at least a significant controlling portion of the nation, into his vassals, and they will do whatever they have to do to get the churches opened again. Okay? Now, in this case, the purpose, as in most cases, the purpose of this interdict was to turn the people's hearts against the king, to have him either comply with the Pope's wishes and allow the Pope to pick the vassals of the church, or to have him overthrown. Okay? This is how the Pope rules over the kings of the earth. This is the exercise that the popes used in every instance to gain complete control over every government. The use of interdict and other things, even including assassinations. This is how the Pope rules over the kings of the earth. They use assassination, they use blackmail, they use interdicts, they use spiritual sanctions, temporal sanctions, monetary sanctions, and direct war to maintain control of every nation. And in this case, it's England. So now we've kind of reviewed where we've been last week in this reading. Now we'll continue with some more of the details about how this interdict was imposed upon England. We're reading in the last few sentences on page 286. This is subsection 46, page 286, the last few sentences. It says, Mass, that is one of the sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church, whereby grace is obtained, that is, Mass was celebrated with closed doors, and none but the priest were admitted to that holy institution. Okay? This is where the Roman Catholic Pope, or Roman Catholic priest presiding over the Mass, stands before the congregation, elevates the consecrated host, and says, "This is the body of Christ. Hoc est corpus meus." And at that point, the little bell rings, and supposedly this little piece of bread, though it never changes in its appearance, according to Roman Catholic canon law, you must believe that it is changed from bread into the literal blood, body, soul, and divinity of Christ. And that it is sacrificed once again on the altar of the Roman Catholic Church, as though there must be many sacrifices of Christ, which is simply an outward testimony that what Christ did on the cross 2,000 years was not efficacious, and that in order for it to be efficacious, he must perpetually die, be crucified perpetually. This is how Satan and his church, the synagogue of Satan, the Roman Catholic Church, makes a complete mockery of what Jesus did. It is a church that professes to be Christian, yet it hates Christ. Now, that the people believe in this hocus pocus, and that Christ must be ritually, eternally sacrificed. If they cannot participate in the Mass, then there's no atonement, is there? See what a desperate situation Roman Catholics are when the Pope imposes an interdict on the church? And this is what happens. The priests only are allowed to participate in this so-called sacrament of the Mass. The laity, no one else in the country is permitted to participate, only the priests. So the church doors are shut and locked. The priests conduct the Mass, and no one benefits but the priests. No one obtains grace but the priests. Everyone else is left to die in their sins. Now, what does this mean to a Protestant? Well, it's a laughingstock. We know where we get our salvation. It's not from the Mass. It's from Jesus and his one-time, all-sufficient sacrifice for sin. He became sin for us, the righteous for the unrighteous. He redeemed us to God. It's a done deal. We don't participate in Mass or any other sacrifice. For to participate in any other sacrifice is to admit what the Roman Catholic Church proudly boasts, that Christ's death was insufficient. So Protestants would pay no heed at all to an interdict by the Pope. But if all the rest of the country participates in this, we're swept along with it. And we become objects of hatred, objects of persecution, and this is the life of a saint. Okay? The true believers of Christ have two planks in their belief, that Jesus is the Christ and the papacy is the Antichrist. And when we openly and secretly declare the papacy as the Antichrist, we come under persecution. That's just the way it is. We do not serve two masters. We have but one master. All right, continuing now, Mass was celebrated with closed doors, and none but the priests were admitted to that holy institution. The laity partook of no religious rite. In other words, none of the sacraments except the communion to the dying. That is, last rites was the only sacrament that they could participate in, and that's just the last opportunity that the Roman Catholic priest has to come to the deathbed of the dying Roman Catholic and plead for a gift for the church in order to buy salvation. And if the dying man falls for this malarkey, he'll sign all of his goods over to the Roman Catholic Church. It's a money-making scheme right out of the pits of hell. And it's no wonder that this is the only sacrament that can be participated in under an interdict. Another opportunity for the Roman Catholic Church to gain all the possessions of the dying Roman Catholic. And it says the dead were not interred. They were not buried in consecrated ground. They were thrown into ditches or buried in common fields, and their obsequies were not attended with prayers or any hallowed ceremony. This is what happens when the Pope closes the churches, issues an interdict, imposes an interdict on a nation. This is the power of the Pope. And it says marriage was celebrated in the churchyard, and that every action in life might bear the marks of the dreadful situation, the people were prohibited the use of meat, as in Lent, or times of the highest penance, were debarred from all pleasures and entertainments, and were forbidden even to salute each other, or so much as to shave their beards, and give any decent attention to their apparel. In other words, they were made to live like destitute and dejected hermits. Okay? Unshaved and unwashed, in a state of total penance, as long as the interdict was imposed by the papacy. He says every circumstance carried symptoms of the deepest distress and of the most immediate apprehension of divine vengeance and indignation, unquote. So you can see the whole country is reduced to morbid depression, spiritual depression, all because of this pretended power of the Pope. Now the author continues, he says, when this interdict had continued for about 2 years, the Pope, that is Innocent III, proceeded a step further and pronounced the awful sentence of excommunication against King John, which he commanded the bishops of London, Ely, and Worcester, his most obsequious tools, to publish in England. These prelates, who then resided on the continent, sent copies of the sentence and of the Pope's commands to publish it in their churches to the bishops and clergy who remained in England. Okay, so these commands of the Pope were issued remotely from his legates who had fled to the continent. All right? They weren't going to be subject to the king nor his terrors, and the Pope was protecting them. They were his vassals, and they were the ones who were assigned to communicate this excommunication so that it be read and understood by the king and published for all of England to read. The author continues, he says, these prelates, who then resided on the continent, sent copies of the sentence and of the Pope's commands to publish it in the churches to the bishops and the clergy who remained in England. But such was their dread of the royal indignation, in other words, the anger of King John, that none of them had the courage to execute these commands. Geoffrey, Archdeacon of Norwich, one of the king's judges, when sitting on the bench of the Exchequer in Westminster, declared to the other judges that the king was excommunicated, and that he did not think it lawful for himself to act any longer in his name, for which declaration he was thrown into prison, where he soon died. Okay, so this war between the Pope and the king is a life-threatening situation. If anyone fell in line with the Pope, they were in fear of imprisonment and death by the king. And if they took sides with the king, they were threatened with excommunication and eternal damnation by the Pope. And this is the situation that existed in England, just like it existed on the mainland when the papacy was in contention with Henry IV over this very same subject, the power of investiture. Now, subsection 47 on page 287, if you're following along, it says, in the year 1211, the Pope sent two legates into England whose names were Pandolf and Durand. These legates were admitted to an audience at a parliament which was held in Northampton when a most violent altercation took place between them and King John. Pandolf plainly told the king, King John, even in the face of his parliament, that he was bound to obey the Pope in temporals as well as in spirituals. That is, through the papacy had control over King John's spiritual life and his temporal life, that is, his life as a king, and that King John must obey the Pope not only in spiritual things and obtain from the Pope himself his own spiritual welfare as the great high priest of quote-unquote Christendom, but that he also must obey the Pope in temporals. All right? King of kings and Lord of lords. This is what the papacy demands of every king in the world, that he acknowledge the Pope as the King of kings and Lord of lords. He is the all in all. He is the Alpha and Omega of so-called Christianity. And any king in the world that either denies the Pope's spiritual power, and especially those who deny his temporal power, are brought against the very wrath of the papacy. And this is still true today. Now, Pandolf plainly told the king, even in the face of his own parliament, that he was bound to obey the Pope in temporals as well as in spirituals. And when John refused to submit to the will of His Holiness the Pope without reserve, the legate, with shameless effrontery, published the sentence of excommunication against him with a loud voice, absolving all of his subjects from their oath of allegiance, and degrading him, King John, from his royal dignity, and declared that neither he nor any of his posterity should ever reign in England. Okay? This is the Pope's power. He has the power to absolve all the citizens of England from their oaths. their oaths of allegiance to King John. Just by waving his hand, he can declare that no oath of allegiance that was ever given to King John has the weight of a breath. He has no more royalty. He has no more dignity. He has no more authority. And neither he nor any of his heirs shall ever again rule in England. So Pope John, by this decree of the Pope, is toast. Okay? Now he says this was certainly carrying clerical insolence to the height of extravagance. But in those unhappy times, the meanest agents, that is, the least agents of the Pope, insulted the greatest princes with impunity. Okay, this is the noonday for the Pope. They were all powerful. They wielded the same power and authority and threat to the kings of all the other countries of the world, just like they did in England. This was the noonday for the papacy and the midnight of the world, and particularly the midnight of England. It says, on the return of the legates to Rome in the following year, Pope Innocent solemnly ratified all their proceedings against the King of England. And finding that is, he made it Roman Catholic canon law. That's what it means. This was entered into the canon of Catholic canon law. All that was decreed by his legates in England, his overthrow of the government, the dismissal of all oaths of allegiance to King John became Roman Catholic canon law. It says, on the return of the legates to Rome in the following year, Pope Innocent solemnly ratified, that is, made it canon law, all their proceedings against the King of England, and finding that all the success which he expected from them had not ensued, he proceeded to more violent measures. Listen carefully. The Pope pronounced with great solemnity a sentence of deposition against King John. In other words, they were going to depose him, kick him off his throne, and of excommunication against all who should obey him. That is, anybody who obeys King John is excommunicated and eternally damned. That's what that means. Or anyone who maintains a connection with him. Okay? No longer are their oaths of allegiance any good, but anybody who protects, defends, or sides with King John, you're damned. Now, to Protestants, this is just all a bunch of hot air. But to Roman Catholic England at this time, this was a controlling power. Now, he says, when these sentences were known in England, they began to excite the superstitious fears of some of the barons, who were at the same time much dissatisfied with the prince for his imprudent, illegal, and oppressive government. So now the barons are beginning to tremble under the weight of these papal thunders. So John, having received intimations of this and various quarters, became not a little alarmed and began to stagger in his resolution. Okay? John began to lose the allegiance of his most loyal friends. King John of England is finding himself to becoming a singularity. It's the Pope and all of England against King John. This is the power of the Pope. Now, subsection 48, page 288 will continue. He says, to render the sentence of deposition, that is, to unthrone the king, to dethrone the king, against King John effectual, the Pope appointed, listen to this, the Pope appointed Philip, King of France, to put it in execution, and promised him the pardon of all of his sins and the kingdom of England for his reward, a temptation which that prince had neither the wisdom nor virtue to resist. Okay? So King Philip of France was a papist, and he was given full pardon for all of his sins, and you know there must have been plenty, if he would just mount up his army, march into England, and impose this interdict and to dethrone John. He'd become the new king of England. Here's how the Pope foments war. Now, when the nations of the world go to war today, are they driven by circumstance or fate? Or are they driven by the Pope? Is the Pope calling on all the nations of the world to mount up and go to war overseas? I'm telling you, he does. The wars don't happen by happenstance or circumstance. It is the Pope, just as in this day in England, it is the Pope who leads the Crusades. And you pay for it. Your sons and daughters pay for it with their blood and their guts and with your tax dollars. And what does it all achieve? More greater and greater power for the Pope. Of course, we're sold a bill of goods about the pretended reasons for the wars, and if it's necessary for the government to conduct some false flag operation on its shores, on its very shores, and kill thousands of Americans, they can do so if it incites the nation to war to accomplish a papal objective. And this is just exactly what 9/11 was. It was a government-sponsored false flag operation against New York City and the Twin Towers and all of that to incite this country to war. And in a day, this country was ready to go to war. You just show us what direction. Make sure we have plenty of victuals and ammunition, and we'll turn this world into a dust bowl. And so the United States military went off to war, never being given information as to what purpose that war was really all about. Now, of course, there are some in this country beginning to wake up and smell the coffee. They're convinced, irretrievably, that our own government did 9/11. And they're absolutely correct about it. But what they fail to recognize is the very man who authorized all of this made a brief but very popular appearance at the scene of his own crime. Pope Benedict XVI descended to the bottom of the bathtub where those buildings previously stood, and in the remaining rubble set up his little altar and prayed, while all the cameras of the United States were rolling and recording every diabolical antichrist act he made that day. How many Americans will wake up and know that the Pope simply returned to the scene of his very own crime? And because of that false flag operation, the United States went off on another crusade at your expense to do nothing more than to extend the power, the temporal and spiritual power of the Pope in this new global kingdom, the New World Order. It's nothing more, nothing less than the restoration of the old world order about which we are reading this very morning. The whole purpose of all the wars fought by the United States of America was to extend the power and authority, both spiritual and temporal, of the man of sin, the son of perdition, the Antichrist of the Bible. And it has all been done on Protestant blood and guts. Why? Because we've denied the truth. We no longer proclaim the Pope to be the Antichrist, the son of perdition. We all believe that the Antichrist hasn't even shown himself in the world and won't do so until just 7 years before Christ returns. We have repudiated our own Protestant Reformation by this belief. We have made a laughingstock of Protestantism. We believe in a futurist fulfillment of Daniel's 70th week instead of the historical fulfillment as recorded verbatim in the New Testament of the Bible. The New Testament of the Bible is simply the historical account of the actual historical fulfillment of Daniel's 70th week. That 7-year period of time from Christ's baptism, 3.5 years until his crucifixion, 3.5 years until the remaining 3.5 years till the going forth of the gospel to the Gentiles, of the saving of the house of Cornelius. It was Jesus who made a covenant with many for 1 week, 1 7-year period of time, and in the midst of the week he caused the sacrifices and oblations to cease by becoming the sacrifice himself. Now, anyone today who makes a sacrifice, whether it's a bloody sacrifice, as is hoped to be fulfilled in Jerusalem in a new rebuilt temple, the sacrifice of animals, or the sacrifice of the Mass, anyone who performs any kind of sacrifice for the remission of sins for salvation has committed an unpardonable blasphemy against Christ. You have denied the sacrifice that Jesus made during the 70th and the final week of Daniel's prophecy. You have rendered the sacrifice of Christ on the cross 2,000 years ago of no effect. Both Jew and Gentile blaspheme his holy name every time they make a sacrifice. And they shed the onus of this Antichrist away from the papacy when they profess in a future fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. And not only that, they deny that Jesus was the Christ. If you believe the 70th week is yet future, you have denied the historical and prophetic fulfillment of every tenet of that prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, where Daniel prophesied the coming of Messiah. Virtually gave the world a calendar date when he could be expected. Of that day and hour we knew full well, when Christ would come to redeem us with his own blood. Daniel prophesied it. It was fulfilled in every respect in the life of Christ. The 70th week of Daniel is over. Jesus is the Christ. And if you believe in a future fulfillment, you have literally denied that Jesus was the Christ. You may profess Christ with your mouth, but in your heart of hearts you deny him. Jesus fulfilled the 70th week of Daniel 2,000 years ago, perfectly and completely. It's done. It is finished. The veil of the temple is rent. No more animal sacrifices. No more sacrifices of any kind. And if you do not believe that Jesus is He, the He of Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, you will die in your sins. That's what the New Testament records. Jesus said with his own mouth, if you do not believe that I am He, the He of Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, you will die in your sins. If you do not believe that I am the He spoken of by Daniel in his prophecy, you will die in your sins. It is Jesus who made a covenant with many for 1 week and fulfilled that covenant. And if you say that 70th and final week of Daniel is not fulfilled, you have denied Jesus as the Christ. It's just as simple as that. And you must repent. You see how this man of sin in Rome has deceived us all? Do you see how we have been co-opted to become his crusaders all over the world? This papacy is specifically spoken of in Revelation chapter 13 as the first beast. And we are reading the history of how he became the first beast. But Revelation chapter 13 speaks of a second beast. And it's up for us to know who that second beast is. And what is it about that second beast? Proclaimed by the Bible, it says it causes the whole world to worship the first beast. That second beast of Revelation chapter 13 is the United States of America and all of its allies. Together, we are causing the whole world to worship the first beast by war, by economic sanction, by every other means. The United States is not a Christian nation by any stretch of the imagination. It is the enemy of God. That's the truth. That's the prophetic truth of the United States of America. And it's the most bitter pill to swallow. It's a most frightful reality. Think about it. Pray about it. Read the Scriptures. It's the only book of truth on the planet. And if you read it and understand it as it is written, you can't come to any other conclusion. The Pope rules again over the kings of the earth. And it's the United States that is imposing that rule all over the earth. Without the United States, the papacy is incapable of it. It's a most hideous reality. It's one that the vast majority of this country is going to deny out of self-preservation. But they won't be preserved. All right, subsection 48, we're going to continue. To render the sentence of deposition against King John effectual, the Pope appointed Philip, King of France, to put it in execution and promised him pardon of all of his sins and the kingdom of England for his reward, a temptation which that prince had neither the wisdom nor the virtue to resist. In other words, he was a papist. He wasn't a Christian. Blinded by his ambition, he commanded a large army to assemble at Rouen and prepared a fleet of 1,700 vessels to convey them to England. 1,700 ships. All these preparations, however, only served to promote the purposes of the court of Rome. Did you hear that? All these preparations, however, only served to promote the purposes of the court of Rome. Nobody else was going to benefit from this. It says, for as soon as John was sufficiently intimidated by his dread of the French army and his suspicions of his own subjects, even his barons were rebelling against him, to induce him to make an ignominious surrender of his crown and kingdom to the Pope. The French king was obliged to abandon his enterprise against England to avoid the thunders of the church, the dreadful effects of which he had before his eyes. The Pope determined throughout all of this to force King John to his knees. And that he did. It says, the trembling King John now implored the protection of Rome, whatever submission it might cost him. The legate assured him that the supreme pontiff would require nothing which was not absolutely necessary either to the honor of the church or the safety of the kingdom himself. In other words, he told King John, you have to trust me in all that I do. No more resistance. You have to completely submit to my authority and let me handle this situation. He proposed, therefore, to withdraw the excommunication immediately on condition of John's promising to receive Langton as his archbishop. There you go. There was the object to begin with. The Pope demanded his sole prerogative to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury. His power of investiture. That was the goal of all of this. He proposed, therefore, to withdraw the excommunication immediately on the condition of John's promising to receive, that is, to accept Langton as the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose promotion to the primacy had been the occasion of all this furious contest with all the bishops and the clergy who acknowledged him, and to indemnify them of all the damage that they had sustained. In other words, the king was responsible to restore the church to everything that it had before. That was part of his allegiance to the Pope. And to all of this, the King of England consented. But the consummation of ignominy was yet to come. In other words, the greatest humiliation of King John was yet to come. Under the specious pretext of securing England from the attacks of French King Philip, it was suggested to John to surrender his kingdoms to the Pope. Okay, do you see the strategy here? The Pope is telling King John that if you wish to stave off the French invasion of your country, the only way to guarantee that French King Philip will not invade your country is if you completely surrender all of your kingdom to the Pope, because King Philip wouldn't dare. The papist King Philip of France would not dare to attack a country owned lock, stock, and barrel by the Pope. You see what the Pope's doing here? He said, under the specious, that is the lying pretext of securing England from attacks by King Philip, it was suggested to John to surrender his kingdoms to the Pope as to a Lord Paramount, to swear fealty to him, the Pope, to receive the British islands back as fiefs of the Holy See. In other words, you award to me, the Pope, all of your kingdoms. Not just England proper, but Ireland and all the islands and all of your possessions. You give them lock, stock, and barrel to the Pope. For King Philip would not attack a nation belonging strictly to the Pope. And then, after you give this to me, then we're going to erase the slate. And I'm going to give it all back to you, including your crown, as long as you acknowledge that you got it all from me and me alone. That is, forever, England will be a property of the Roman Catholic Church. And you will be the vassals under the Pope, ruling it at his behest. And King John did this. He awarded all of England and all of its possessions to Pope Innocent III in order supposedly to protect himself from Roman Catholic King Philip of France. This is English history. And you were never told of it for a reason. Because if you're never told this history, you may never imagine, much less conceive, that the same power of the Pope is wielded over the United States of America. That is to remain a secret. That's the truth. Okay? King John is going to, once having surrendered all to the Pope is now going to erase the slate, give it all back to King John, including his crown, so long as John swears eternal fealty and binds England for its entire history to be the property of the Pope. Okay? It says, under the specious pretext of securing England from the attacks of French King Philip, it was suggested to John to surrender his kingdoms to the Pope as to a lord paramount, to swear fealty to him, the Pope, to receive the British Islands back as fiefs of the Holy See, and to pay an annual tribute, that is a tax, for all these possessions of 700 marks of silver for England and 300 for Ireland. So every year, England pays 1,000 marks of silver to the papacy for its privilege to rule England in the Pope's behest. That's a fact that still remains today. And it says, on the 12th of May, 1213, John performed all the degrading ceremonials of resignation, homage, and fealty. You know, someone famous in American history would have called the 12th of May, 1213, as a day which will live in infamy for England. John performed all the degrading ceremonies demanded of him for his resignation, his homage, and his fealty to the Pope. On his knees, he humbly offered his kingdoms to the Pope and put them into the hands of the legate, Pandolf, who retained them for 5 days. He offered his tribute, that is the 1,000 marks of silver, which the legate threw down on the ground and trampled on. Okay? The Pope's representative took that 1,000 pieces of silver and cast them to the ground and trampled on them. But then afterwards condescended to gather them up. This was nothing but an act of humiliation. You ever have your nose rubbed in it? That's what this legate did. And he did it at the Pope's behest. This is the humiliation that the papacy demonstrates to all kings of the earth who would betray him and who would propose to put themselves under his protection and be his slaves. And the United States of America is the second beast of Revelation chapter 13 who caused the whole world to worship the Pope. I'll see you tomorrow.